You see the extraordinary resilience and strength in these communities that despite so many years of so much difficulty and maltreatment, we have thriving and strong Aboriginal communities full of extraordinary people, strong people.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
Because by looking at the stars, we are literally looking back through time.
And as the world gets smaller and more connected, the narrative of freedom is rubbing off on people of different cultures and religions, however remote.
You can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, and thinking new thoughts and so on.
Welcome to BLab Quotes. My name is Hamid Siddiqui alongside Alex Ray. Today we have Dr. Rebekah Grace at the Ingham Institute, and we're really excited to talk to her. You research, we asked actually what we should call her, and she said development psychology because she's so multidisciplinary.
Rebekah has one of these very hard kind of research areas to kind of characterize in one word because it's very multidisciplinary. Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah. So how about we get into what inspired you to get into research?
Well, I think part of the reason, maybe we should talk about why we wanted to have Rebekah on first. Part of the reason I think why we wanted to have you on, Rebekah, is because marginalised groups face particular challenges. And we believe like one of the best ways to kind of make a more equitable society is kind of address those issues. So it's really good to have somebody on who works in the area of marginalised communities. Yeah.
So let's get into why you got into your research and what inspired you to get down this path.
So this will sound cheesy, but this is the true story. So I'll tell you it
like
regardless of
cheesy.
I read an article in a magazine, actually. So while I was an undergraduate student studying psychology at Sydney University, I read an article that had quite a vivid, an image of a baby that had been abandoned, a baby girl that had been abandoned. And the article was about this baby girl and what was now going to happen to her, and they were unable to find her mother. And this article broke my heart. You know, sometimes you read something that really stays with you. And it broke my heart not only for this baby, for this child, but my heart actually broke for the mother of this child as well. And I wondered a lot about the circumstances that had led to the abandonment of that baby, and whether that mother had felt that she had no choice but to do that, and what sort of circumstances could lead to that kind of a decision. And for whatever reason, that article really stayed with me, and I became really, interested and concerned for the sort of supports that exist within our community and how we support those who are most vulnerable within our communities. And so that became a real catalyst then for an interest in this area. And my focus is very much on children and families. So, I suppose something that I feel really strongly committed to is the idea that every child in our community, in Australia or in the world, should have every opportunity to thrive and to be safe, regardless of the circumstances that they're born into. And so that was the beginning of my journey, I suppose, just the reading of that article.
That sorry to interrupt, that's really interesting, because I view kids as, it's like you either win the lottery as a child or you don't. You have there's nothing that you could have done to choose where you're born, who your parents are, what environment you're born to. And so then if you're born as a child in a really disadvantaged situation, it's really unfair for you.
And it is not an even playing field.
And I think we should design society in such a way that if you could choose to be born incarnated into this world, you wouldn't know who you would be born as. So you could be born as a rich person, as a poor person, as a person who's disabled, but you'd still enjoy life. And it'd be...
It's like the veil of ignorance. I think probably going to butcher this, so I'm not a philosopher, but is it John Rawls, I think, who had the veil of ignorance, and he said that exactly that, right? We should try and design our societies as if you don't know who you are.
Yeah.
So before you come into it, you don't know what person you're going to be in society, what your circumstances are. You don't know, if you're going to be born to a disadvantaged household, perhaps you're going to be a drug addict, you might even be a criminal in a jail. And if you design societies with that in mind, hey, I could be anyone, it kind of, you start to acknowledge that, like you said, we don't all live in an equal playing field.
That's right. But I subscribe really strongly to that idea of the village. Like, I feel that we're all responsible for the well-being and safety of all of the children in our communities, and I take that really seriously, both on a personal and on a professional level.
Yeah.
So you read that article and you were doing your PhD at that time?
So I was an undergraduate student at that point.
Okay.
And I was also working in a respite care facility for kids with disabilities, just as my part-time job to help support me through university. And I think that really gave me some insight into the challenges of families who are caring for children who have high support needs, but also the strengths and the opportunities that are part of that experience. And so I was having a few different experiences that were exposing me to different ways of, different challenges that families were experiencing in lots of different ways. So at the end of my undergraduate studies, at the end of my honours year, I was offered a place in the PhD program and was really excited to take that. And I don't know if I'm going off track, so pull me back.
No, whatever you want. Yeah.
But we talked a little before the podcast started about how intimidating that journey into postgraduate studies can be, and that was certainly my experience as I started my PhD. I felt the pressure to be brilliant and wondered if I was at all, or if I ever could be, and so I advertised a research position with Professor Gwyneth Llewellyn at Sydney University, and her research was all around supporting families who have children with high support needs. So this was a lovely match for me in terms of that employment experience that I'd had. I was really interested in those issues, but also I thought I need to work in a research project because I need to figure out how to be a good researcher if I'm going to be successful in my own PhD.
Yeah.
And so that experience of working with Gwyneth Llewellyn and being on her team and speaking to more than 100 families about the sorts of support that they needed to be able to do the best job they could in terms of raising their children was inspiring for me. And that was really when I caught the research bug, and I could really see that research had the potential for such important impact. I guess before then I'd seen researchers sitting, I suppose the ivory tower model of research where, very brilliant people did very brilliant things, and there was a hope that would filter through to having some kind of impact. But in working with Gwyneth, I could see the intersection between policy and practice and research, and how essential research is to that process, and how impactful research really could be. So I think that's when research really started to become a passion for me, and influenced then the way my own research career proceeded from that point on.
Well, so you saw the potential impact that research can have, and that's what sort of captured you about it.
Absolutely. I'm a huge respecter and admirer of pure research and lab-based research. There's such an important, brilliant people doing wonderful work. But for me, I only became really passionate about research when I felt that it could have a very direct impact. And that's the intersection that really interests me. That's where I want to sit, right on the cusp between the rigour of research and understanding policy and practice, and how to translate. So, people talk about translational research, how to translate research, how to translate practice and policy back into research, that sort of give and take, and how research can directly influence the implementation of, services, programs, initiatives, to have an impact on the ground with families. That's the pointy end, and that's where I'm most interested to sit.
We wanted to kind of get to a little bit of that later, and also some of your mixed methods approaches that you've taken. But maybe first, and we already have talked a little bit about this, but maybe we can... maybe you could tell us a little bit about the specific challenges that a lot of these disadvantaged groups that you work with. I know you work particularly with Aboriginal communities. So what are some of the particular challenges that these groups actually face?
That's a huge question.
maybe because you're more in the field of health and I believe education a bit as well.
That's
so maybe
right.
you can focus on those.
But probably, the biggest Well, so for me, from my point of view, the biggest issue is the level of trauma that exists within these communities. And I think that it's essential that researchers or service workers or anybody who wants to engage with Indigenous communities understands the intergenerational trauma. I'm concerned when sometimes we talk about negative behaviours that happen within Aboriginal communities and lots of other communities, of course, and for other families as well. But we point to some of those difficulties, and the implication is that that's an Indigenous thing, or that it's a problem with the Indigenous community. Whereas I actually see so much of that as symptoms or evidence of trauma within those communities. And of course, these communities have endured many, many years worth of ongoing trauma. And so I think a trauma lens is actually really important. And I don't want that. I certainly don't look at Aboriginal communities and use that trauma lens to see them as sort of injured or broken people. Please don't take what I'm saying to imply that. But I do think we need to understand that the mistrust of services, for example, makes complete sense because we've betrayed them, or mainstream services have betrayed them over and over again and have not met their needs over and over again. Their mistrust of academics and researchers is completely understandable. The concern for their children and not wanting to expose themselves to any sort of scrutiny around the way that they're raising their children is completely understandable because they've been so misunderstood for so many years. So I actually think understanding intergenerational trauma is probably one of the most important things. And then you can work with Aboriginal people, and instead of seeing them as broken and traumatised, you see the extraordinary resilience and strength in these communities that despite so many years of so much difficulty and maltreatment, we have thriving and strong Aboriginal communities full of extraordinary people, strong people. I don't think I know especially women, the women that I encounter within Aboriginal communities, I don't know that I've met anywhere else collections of such strong and resilient women who will fight for their children and fight for their communities. And so I think when you understand trauma, it actually opens the way for you to see resilience and strength.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was reading an article recently about, I think, a new TV station for Aboriginal health in Arnhem Land. I don't know if you've heard of that. I think it's just been funded. But they were saying a similar thing, that it's less about like kind of talking down to people like you have these problems and here's how to fix them. Because this is a TV station dedicated to just health TV. And so there's like, they're trying to encourage Aboriginal people to go to the healthcare services and things like that. And they were talking to a lot of Aboriginal leaders and said that it's really only going to work if you kind of meet us like eye to eye.
Yeah, and I guess, one of the guiding principles from my perspective is reciprocity. So, I spend a lot of time just talking to Aboriginal people and seeking to understand their perspectives, seeking to understand what's important to them, sharing, what's important to me. So that sort of reciprocity in that relationship. And that's kind of challenging and interesting as a researcher because, well, it's time consuming. I mean, so for me, it's all about relationship. And I see research as entirely about relationship, especially the sort of research that I do. And that is time consuming, and there isn't time within the workload, the academic workload model for relationship building or sitting under gum trees, just talking and seeking to understand somebody else's perspective. And so that can be challenging as a researcher when the expectation is that you have to have written this many papers and this many grants and you have, this much marking to do and whatever. But nothing is more important than that to me. And I've spent many a whole day or many an afternoon just simply talking. And I think that sort of building of trust and relationship, I think also being willing to alter your research, to change your questions, to allow the questions to be generated. When I say allow, that's terrible because that sounds like I'm still in the control position, but encouraging the generation of research questions from the community, being open to the way that you evaluate or the sorts of instruments that you include in your research so that they're comfortable and meaningful for the community that you're working with.
Yeah.
Like that kind of thinking, the co-design of services, the co-design of research. Those are words that are often thrown around, but my hope is that I can do that genuinely and legitimately, that that really it can be about relationship and reciprocity. And so I spend a lot of time, not just, there are other good researchers who do the same thing, I'm not saying this is special about me in particular, but a lot of time seeking to build relationship and reciprocity.
Yeah.
And so by reciprocity, even things like I've written grants for Indigenous communities, for example. So I wrote a grant to help the Broken Hill community get a bus to help with their mobile toy library. And, that's not something that sits on my CV. That's not, something that builds my track record in any way. And but I did that. That's about reciprocity. I think relationship and reciprocity is key to this kind of work.
Yeah, especially as you mentioned, the skepticism that the community has towards academia and services. Because they've been let down by them so much in the past. So it's important to build that trust and have reciprocity. You mentioned that your research question shifts, working with the community. Can you give us an example of how?
Yeah. Because just to back up on that, another question we had from you is about how you, and you answered a little bit then by talking to people, but how you actually go about approaching research with using mixed methods, because we're both pretty hardcore scientists, so strictly quantitative research. So maybe you could talk about that as well.
So which question do you want me to answer first?
Just jump on my question, hijack it. Don't worry about Hamid's question. No.
So your question
I'm
was...
just curious about how your research question shifts and changes, and if you can give us an example of how that's happened.
Oh, sure. So, for example, I'm a chief investigator on a project called the Guriga Project. Guriga means healthy baby in the language of the Tharawal people, which is the Aboriginal people who live in the Campbelltown sort of area, and we do a lot of work with that community. And we've been conducting a longitudinal birth cohort study with 150 Aboriginal infants all born at Campbelltown Hospital, and we've been tracking them, and those children are sort of 12 now. Oh, wow. But so we were looking at pursuing that research and continuing to track those young people into adolescence. And so most of the questions we wanted to ask were still around their academic performance and their development and such. But in talking to the Aboriginal community, there was much stronger interest in things like teenage pregnancy and, effective prevention of teenage pregnancy. And so, there was just then a shift in research focus to respond to the questions that were actually most interesting and meaningful to them. But often that shift happens right back at the beginning. So that's an example of where a project's been happening, and then we've sort of our course has been influenced by the interests of the community. But often those shifts happen right back in the beginning, and as part of that sort of co-design or those initial conversations, there can be a shift. So, for example, I do quite a lot of work with an organisation called Wanange, which is an Aboriginal organisation that works with communities and children who are, particularly children who've been removed into out-of-home care. And so, there have been questions and research programs that have been generated as part of that collaboration to fit with the interests of that organisation. So, it's about doing not what only is sort of scientifically meaningful, but what's meaningful to community. I think that's extremely important. They need to feel that their questions are being answered.
In that, I assume that as the more that approach is used, the more willing they would be to participate in further
absolutely.
research.
Yeah, absolutely, because it makes sense to them.
Because they see you as on their team. That you're trying to actually help them rather than just say, this is what we want to do, come do this for us.
That's right. And we really, researchers without meaning to really can sometimes come in like steamrollers. We have very strict timelines and very limited amounts of money, and we need to have things happen quickly and on time. And so with all the best intention in the world, I think researchers can be perceived as steamrollers, just in there to get the data that they need. And, I'm just very, very resistant to that.
Your question, Alex.
Oh, no, I think you kind of answered it as well.
The mixed methods thing?
Yeah, well, not even just the mixed methods thing, but how you approach research.
Researching.
Yeah. But maybe we can move on to now, which you mentioned before, where your focus was about how your research, you really want it to inform policy, because we kind of had a bit of a segue there, right?
Yeah.
So how do you, as a researcher, go about making that next step? Okay, you've got this data, you've found something out, you've answered a research question, but how do you then turn that into like a procedural change or a policy change? Because that's where the real like action happens, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think what I've learned, so early in my career, the way that you just described it is the way it would often happen, where you'd do a project, you'd have your data, you'd have your findings, and then you'd go out there to try and get policymakers to pay attention to it. And you'd be hoping like hell it just didn't end up on some kind of shelf somewhere, ignored. But the more the years have gone on, the more I realised that the most effective way to engage policymakers is also from the beginning. So rarely now do I do a project and have data and then I'm going to policymakers to say, I've got a story to tell that you need to hear. Just like there's that reciprocity and relationship building with community, those same principles apply in terms of policymakers. So right back at the beginning when we have research ideas, I want to talk to policymakers, I want to talk to people in government, I want to talk to service organisations. Say, is this meaningful to you? How should we shift and think about these questions so that they answer your questions? Will you partner with us on this? Will you be part of this journey from the beginning? And I think that's the way that you have impact, is to engage with them from the very, very beginning and along the whole process. And then when you have that story to tell at the end, it's a shared story, it's their story too. They've been invested as well. I mean, there are other things, techniques that people know as well, like the way that you deliver the information. We know that you have to have really snappy one-pages, that people really aren't going to read much more than that, at least not initially. You have to get their attention. And some people say now that even one page is way too much. Basically, you need a snappy paragraph, nice, clear paragraph. So there are definitely things like that in terms of the way that you communicate your results. And we think a lot about that, and that's really challenging for academics. We talk in a particular way, and so I personally have found that quite challenging to have simple, straightforward messages, because we want to put all the caveats in and and protect ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's quite a skill that I'm still learning and still trying to be really good at. But I think the clue to engaging is about reciprocity, relationship, respect, and involvement from the very beginning. And I don't think, if you can't really get that buy-in from the beginning, I think you've got a bit of an uphill battle, really, in terms of engaging them at the end. I'm not saying it can't happen, but it's tougher, a much tougher journey, much tougher road.
There's also, you're mentioning before about like those snappy paragraphs.
Yeah.
As researchers and academics, we're used to like writing things like papers, and there's set formats.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think as a researcher, you have to kind of question what the value of papers are. Like, I think it's definitely very valuable to communicate to your peers. Absolutely.
It's very very valuable for other academics. Yes, absolutely.
But if you get like a few hundred citations, like that might be great on an article, but it's really nothing if you have more famous podcast than Blab Coats, you could reach tens of thousands of people. That's right. Theoretically, right?
Yes.
If you write an article in a blog or something like that, you're going to reach tens or hundreds of thousands of people. And so there's really, I think researchers and academics like have to really kind of take those numbers seriously and think about the way we communicate our ideas. Yeah.
And I think the university's changing as well. Like more and more, we're required to write impact statements. So in years past, that isn't a metric on which we were measured. So, so we were absolutely measured on the number of publications and the citations for those papers and how much grant income we brought in, that kind of thing. But there's, things are shifting, and certainly being able to demonstrate impact is becoming more and more important. So that is opening the way for engagement with the conversation, or blog sites or podcasts and those other things are such an important way of communicating and disseminating research. So, that's a really positive thing. But it's tough, actually. Well, I don't know if I only speak for myself. It's tough as a researcher to communicate in that way. So this amazing opportunity where I've just finished a randomised control trial of a volunteer home visiting program, and a great big study that we've run across 4 states of Australia, and was completely supported by a private philanthropist.
Yeah.
Anyway, he also became concerned that the way we communicated was way too academic and way too complicated, and he was always just saying, just give me the punchline, I don't want all of that detail.
Yeah.
And so to support us in being able to do that well, through his connections somehow, he had this absolutely top marketing person who works for MasterCard. I think it's like the top MasterCard marketing person, work with myself and some of the service organisation people over a couple of sessions to help us learn how to communicate a message well to non-academics.
That's good.
And it was incredibly brilliant and useful experience for me, and also really confronting. So, this guy would ask me to stand up and talk about something, and I'd do that, and he'd say, do you know that academics come across as passive aggressive? You just sound so passive aggressive. And I thought I was coming across as confident. And I went home like, oh my gosh, am I passive aggressive? Talk to my friends and my family like, is this who I am? But I just think it's the way that we can come across when we're trying to hedge the way that we speak, because we're very conscious of not making very definitive statements and such. So anyway, it was an amazing opportunity, and I learned a lot. But I don't know that I'm good at it yet. I'm trying really hard to be good at it.
I think you're right in that it's a very different skill, and I know when I was in my undergrad, there wasn't very much of that at all. I had to pick units specifically that had those types of assessments.
Right.
But I'm glad to say I think that's changing a little bit. I think I was mentioning to you before we start, I actually teach a unit in the Master of Research here at Western Sydney Uni called Research Literacies, and that's all apart writing like a blog piece. And that's modelled off the conversation.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
So that's great.
But even that, we were approached last year to start an undergrad unit, and we've been helping out Roger Dawkins, who's from the School of the Humanities and Communication Arts.
And that's all about podcast.
Yeah, I'm just like taking the opportunity to plug that unit for any undergrads like listening to this. That's a unit that any undergrad across the uni can do, and they have to produce a short 10-minute podcast feature where they feature any story they want, but they basically have to tell a story.
That's really brilliant.
Podcasting. So
and do they have non-academics should mark and provide feedback? Because we're really good at talking to each other. But the problem is talking to non-academics. So that's brilliant. And maybe some of us who've been around for a long time and who haven't had the opportunity to participate in courses like that, we should do some professional development, because it's a really tough skill.
It is a skill in and of itself.
I
guess I didn't realize how difficult it was until I hit the Masters of Research, and then I had to translate basic scientific research to a broader audience. I was like, I don't know how to do this properly, So it's definitely, I think it's good in universities. I feel I'm moving towards that translation of knowledge to the broader public. I think there's more emphasis on that. We see more science communicators, more communicators of research, and I think that's a positive, because we want society to be engaged with what research is finding out. Then they can care about stuff, and a good example right now is the climate change, where people don't really engage with the science, and so we have policies and a society that is apathetic to actually making changes that are necessary.
But I guess I would also see the flip side of that. So I think translation is not only about scientists communicating their research to the public, but I think it's also about scientists listening and engaging with the public. So I see this as a reciprocity. So not only an opportunity for the public to change their behaviour based on all that we find and know, an opportunity for research to change and respond based on engagement and understanding what the issues are in terms of community and public. So I completely agree with what you're saying, as long as you're talking about that two-way engagement.
I totally agree. I think nobody likes to be talked down to, They like being heard and listened to, and then be engaged in a conversation rather than just, I'm going to lecture you on the science of climate change.
That's right. That's right.
We're reaching 30 minutes. I know this conversation just flew past.
Very fast.
Tell us, is there anything you'd like people to be aware of, or maybe
You're on Twitter or something.
Twitter
Is there anything you want to plug?
See, I'm very, very bad at those sorts of social media things. That's my goal. That's actually my New Year's resolution this year. I have a Twitter account that I never ever write anything on.
Yeah.
So no, I can't plug a Twitter account. Not yet. But watch this space.
But people could probably contact you through the Ingham Institute if they wanted to get in touch with you.
Please do. We love to talk to people. So I'm the Deputy Director of a centre called the Centre for Translational Research and Social Innovation here at the Ingham Institute, and we do lots of work focused on children and families, and we love to talk to anybody who wants to talk to us.
Excellent.
And are you taking on, I'm not sure if they do this, research students?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And we actually have 2 PhD scholarships advertised at the moment.
Oh, awesome.
So one is all about child voice and participatory methods with children and young people, which is an area that really excites me. I'm so interested in and excited around how to engage children and young people in policy debate and service design in really meaningful ways. So we have a fantastic opportunity there if somebody has a passion around those kinds of issues. And we also have a PhD scholarship advertised at the moment that is about sustained nurse home visiting for vulnerable families. There's a fantastic, amazingly huge international program that is led by Lynn Kemp, who's the director of the centre that I work in, called the MESH program, which is Maternal Early Childhood Sustained Home Visiting, and we want to embed a PhD student within that work. So somebody who has an interest in supporting vulnerable families, and that would be a more quantitative piece of work, there's an opportunity there. So we'd love to find really passionate, fantastic people who might enjoy those opportunities.
Cool.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, Rebekah. We really enjoyed that conversation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
See you guys later. Hey, did you like this episode? If so, why don't you head over to iTunes and rate and review us, like our Facebook and Twitter pages, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. What will help us the most is if you share this episode with a friend and spread the good news.